Hello and welcome back. My name is Frank Altamar, and today we're going to be going through part two. This is episode 3, but we're going to go through part 2 of my treatise titled Infrastructural Psychosis: How Social Media Rewires Our Brains and What We Can Do About It. And today we're going to go into part 2 titled The Myth of a More Connected World: Infrastructural Psychosis. So briefly, in the last episode, we went over part 1. The last 2 episodes, actually, we went over part 1 of the treatise itself, which was talking about the biological architecture of infrastructural psychosis. So basically, our biology and how our brain and the framework of our brain interacts with technology like screens and through the applications that we use through the screens, which is like social media in essence, right? The main tool for communicating. So whereas part 1 deals with the biological element of it, the neurochemistry, the science, the biology, part 2 is going to focus more on the social element, right? So the content itself that's being promoted, how it's being promoted, and in essence, how the algorithms are created and manipulated in order to kind of define this infrastructure of psychosis, this mediated break from reality, right? So we're going to start with part 2 of infrastructural psychosis, the myth of a more connected world, infrastructural psychosis. So, episode 1, the death of the shared map, how algorithms fragment reality. A hallucinated map. Infrastructural psychosis is not a mental illness. It is a mentally ill environment. The digitally mediated social world we inhabit is like living inside a funhouse of mirrors, where every reflection is manipulated, distorted, and recontextualized. The algorithm does not need to tell you a lie, it simply needs to show you a set of meticulously curated truths, anecdotes so exaggerated and so incendiary that your rational mind cannot process them. Whereas we can perceive our behavior as dividing ourselves voluntarily based on politics and ideology, in reality we are being partitioned by an architecture that profits from the collapse of our shared reality. The shrinking of the world. Part 1 focused the war on our biology, the starving of the prefrontal cortex, the jamming of the sensors like the anterior cingulate cortex and the corpus callosum, and the narrowing of our focus and perspective through stress hormones like cortisol and norepinephrine. Infrastructural psychosis is the final result. It is the point where the individual's internal map no longer matches the physical world because the mediator of technology and social media has replaced reality with a fragmented map full of contradictions and clever obfuscations. The death of the shared map. In a functional society, people may disagree on solutions, but they tend to share a basic agreement on what is happening. The exploit. Social media companies know that a shared map is a stable and less reactionary and therefore is less profitable. To increase profit, it must fragment the map. The weapon. It uses the emotional anecdote to create a statistical hallucination. If you are shown 10 videos of a specific crime in a row, your amygdala concludes that the world is a war zone, even if actual statistics show a record-breaking era of peace. The feedback loop of the influencing machine. Terminal velocity, Godwin's law. As the scrolling and engagement reaches terminal velocity, cortisol surges as the mind settles into a perpetual state of anxiety. Norepinephrine is released, further narrowing our focus, and over time, the amygdala loses the ability to distinguish between a minor policy disagreement and an existential threat. This is where Godwin's law comes into play. Godwin's law states, as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of a comparison involving Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. The descent. This is why all digital roads lead to Godwin's law. When the prefrontal cortex is overexhausted and the fuel required for nuance and empathy is gone, Hitler is the only symbol big enough to satisfy the amygdala's demand for a final boss. The prophet. At this stage, infrastructural psychosis has reached its peak. You are 100% engaged, 100% tribal, and 100% predictable. Your opponents are literal Nazis or literal demons. You have been completely co-opted by the algorithm. The feedback loop of the influencing machine. Another terminal velocity is Poe's law. Poe's law states that without a clear indicator of the author's intent, it is impossible to create a parody of extreme views so obviously exaggerated that it cannot be mistaken by some readers for a sincere expression of the views being parodied. This is also referred to by some as post-ironic, where proponents believe that attempts at irony end up revolving back towards sincerity. The psychosis. In infrastructural psychosis, parody and reality merge. You can no longer tell the difference between a real threat and a few wildly exaggerated opinions lined up back to back in your algorithm. The feedback loop of the influencing machine. In clinical psychosis, a patient may believe an external influencing machine is putting thoughts into their head. In infrastructural psychosis, this machine is real. The fog of war. Because the digital infrastructure strips away the human metadata, eye contact, tone, context, and the algorithms strip away context and nuance, every interaction becomes suspect and one-dimensional. The mirage. You are shown the worst version of your neighbor, and your neighbor is shown the worst version of you. Yet both of you are merely reacting to a straw man fallacy, which the algorithm has curated for you in order to generate the most outrage and therefore the most engagement. Episode 2. The Industrialization of the Fallacy, the Algorithmic Straw Man. The straw man. In the domain of logic and argumentation, a straw man fallacy is a static caricature used in place of an actual argument. By reframing your opponent's position into a distorted version of itself, it makes the point easier to argue against. Social media algorithms use a series of high arousal anecdotes to build an algorithmic straw man. It scours the earth for the most irrational, extreme, or offensive example of the other side and places it directly in your algorithm or feed. The exploit. Because the person arguing in the video is real, your amygdala cannot identify it as a simple logical fallacy. Such a task would be relegated to your prefrontal cortex. But with your PFC drained, you are stuck attacking the false argument, which sits in front of a real person. The reality. That person is statistically irrelevant. By presenting the 1 in a million outlier as the representative of a specific position, the infrastructure creates a functional strawman fallacy that the user perceives as an existential threat. The blind spot. The strawman fallacy usually fails when the prefrontal cortex is active because it logically asks, is this person actually representative of the whole group? Yet, because the PFC is already exhausted, it lacks the cognitive resources to do the math. The result? The amygdala accepts the strawman as the most rational argument. You end up fighting a ghost made of cherry-picked data points while the real people in your community become invisible. The symmetry of the fallacy. This is the most destructive part of infrastructural psychosis. The algorithm is building a strawman of you for them at the exact same time as it builds one of them for you. A feed may be full of wacky caricatures of lefties, but you can rest assured that their feed is equally full of wacky caricatures of righties, and so on. The profit. This ensures that no shared map can ever be rebuilt. If both sides are only fighting a straw man of each other, the argument remains forever unresolved, and the 18% profit is forever secured. The straw man is no longer a mistake or a bug in our logic processing. It is a feature of social media architecture. We are being fed a constant stream of the worst possible version of our neighbors. The algorithm manufactures these straw men because they are the most effective fuel for drawing our attention and engagement. Shattering the Overton window. Now, the Overton window is the range of policies or ideas considered acceptable to the mainstream population at any given time. In a healthy society, this window moves slowly through reasoned debate. The exploit. The algorithm doesn't care about acceptability, it cares about arousal. By constantly feeding strawmen into the algorithm, the platform forces the most extreme voices to the center of the feed. The result? This creates a window-shattering effect. Because the prefrontal cortex is too exhausted to verify what is acceptable in traditional political discourse, the constant exposure to extreme anecdotes makes the extreme seem common. The window doesn't move, it disintegrates. Now, the feedback loop of accelerationism. Accelerationism is the idea that the current system, whether social, political, or economic, should be pushed to its more extreme point to force a total collapse or a reboot. Now, infrastructural psychosis. The platform is a natural accelerationist machine. Because peaceful, moderate, and nuanced content provides the lowest profit margin, the infrastructure naturally accelerates the user towards the Godwin's law endpoint. It comes down to an existential battle between the forces of good and evil, right? That's the logical endpoint of infrastructural psychosis. The psychosis. Users begin to feel that the end is near or that everything must burn because they have been blinded by 90% of the reality that is still functioning, right? So within this narrow view of your social media life, your constant feedback loop of your algorithms, right? The negative content that just so happens to from a probabilistic standpoint, show up way more than it probably should, right? And how that's being manipulated. The idea is it pushes people to the Tim Pool angle of civil war. Everything's going to reach a level of civil war. Everything's going to reach the Christian angle of Judgment Day, right? The religious angle, right? Everybody has their personal ideologies, their beliefs, and the idea is that this negative stimulus constantly being forced upon them is forcing them to revert back into the most primal elements of their tribalism, right? Whatever tribe it happens to be. Scientism, religion, philosophy, nihilism, accelerationism, all the isms. So, the engine of collapse, from straw man to God king. As the system accelerates, the straw man created by the algorithm must get bigger and more dangerous to keep the amygdala engaged. A minor disagreement accelerates into a threat to democracy. A threat to democracy accelerates into the final battle between good and evil. This is the logical endpoint. This is where the Overton window is shattered and we enter into total psychosis. People begin to act as if they are in a war zone because their internal map has been replaced by the algorithm's accelerationist narrative of ontological evil. We are told that technology connects us, but its true function is to disconnect us. By shattering the Overton window and replacing it with a hall of rhetorical strawmen, infrastructural psychosis has turned the public square into an accelerationist engine. It is a machine designed to drive us toward the edge of a cliff because the view is 18% more profitable on the way down. What is left is a shift to a deliberate demolition of our shared reality. Okay, so we now move on to episode 3. We're going to be able to get through all of part 2 in this particular video. But episode 3 is titled Post-Mortem of the Shared World, the Ghost in the Machine. So, the death of consensus reality, the post-mortem of a shared world. Now, in the analog era, the world was a physical place where people with different thoughts and ideas had to negotiate for space. Today, the world has been replaced by a mediated environment of hyperreality and individualized echo chambers. When we look at the remains of our shared reality, we can find 4 distinct causes of death. 1. The eviction from the common. In a healthy society, there is common ground, a set of facts, local landmarks, and shared stories that are free for everyone. The cause of death. The algorithm discovered that common ground is a low arousal environment. It's simply too calm. So to keep the amygdala triggered, the system evicted us from the commons and moved us into our own private, personally curated echo chamber. So number 2, the replacement of people with straw men. So in our post-mortem, we see that we mostly stopped interacting in good faith with human beings years ago. The cause of death. The weaponized anecdote killed our ability to see our neighbors. We began to see people as bots or straw men, digital puppets built out of the worst possible traits of our opponents. Number 3, accelerationism and the shattering of the Overton window. We didn't just lose our map, we lost our brakes. The cause of death. By shattering the Overton window, a system created a culture that only values extremism. If a piece of information doesn't accelerate your pulse or your tribe's anger, it is cast aside in favor of more excitatory stimulus. And number 4, the horizon of Godwin's law. The final cause of death, truly, is a loss of scale. When every minor infraction is amplified into a Hitlerian level existential threat, the language of sharing a world becomes impossible. And the result, we have reached terminal velocity. When the majority of what we see on social media is on the scale of an existential threat, there is no room left for the sensible or the conciliatory. The pragmatic conversations that actually build and maintain a civilization are nowhere to be found. A final post-mortem. The final post-mortem of our shared world reveals a chilling truth. The world we used to inhabit hasn't been replaced by nothing. It has been replaced by infrastructural psychosis. The commons, the public square where we used to meet, is now filled with artificial sunlight, right? Blue light and melatonin suppression mediated by screens, which we spend most of our day using. Chemical hooks, right? Variable ratio dopamine addiction, through the pull to refresh algorithms, right? Through the addictive loop of wanting to validate, your outrage and being put into this kind of hypnotic state through the technology itself. We have infrastructural psychosis, right? Which I've been going over the past 2 parts, which is the influencing machine, right? Prior to technology, it was just the manifestations of a delusional schizophrenic mind. But today, it's a literal machine that are servers in Meta's, giant campuses and Google's giant campuses, right? That store all of your information and then feed it back to you in a deliberately altered algorithm and loop in order to manufacture an emotional state out of you, to get money from you, in essence. Clicks, ad revenue, right? It all flows downhill from that. So then we have psychosocial hyperparasitism, right? Which is just the straw man, where they create these exaggerated versions of your world for you to engage and interact in, but they can never really be beaten because they are not really representative of someone who's willing to debate in good faith and act in good faith. Okay, so the ghost in the machine. We stand over the body of a shared reality that we did not realize we had a part in killing. We thought we were just staying informed or winning the argument, when in reality we were facilitating our own exploitation. The shared world is dead, but its ghost still haunts the wires. A flickering image of what happens when rational thought is traded for the emotional anecdote. The true cause of death? 18% more profit for tech and social media companies, right? We can't deny that, if they were to if they were to be neutral in this specific circumstance, that they would tangibly lose money. In fact, that's what the Facebook papers, the part of the leaks revealed. It revealed interactions with management where they basically mention in not so many words that, now knowing this, that they would gain 18% more from having this negative content. It makes it very difficult for them to advocate to not do it, right? So if they know that they're making you more miserable, but it makes them more money, In the typical, if we reference Joel Bakken in his book, The Corporation, where he feels like, if you psychoanalyze corporations, you determine they're psychopaths. Well, what does it mean to be a psychopath? It means to be completely divorced from empathy for the people in favor of the tangible goal of generating as much profit for the corporation as possible, right? So a corporation not being a human being does not have an investment to be empathetic, to allow for you to have more positive content, to have a neutral frame on your content, because it's in essence giving away money, right? So it's just the byproduct of consumerism, and it's a byproduct of the push for profit, overall things, right? So that's going to end part 2 on infrastructural psychosis, right? So basically in part 1, we went over the biological elements of it, right? How they get you hooked, how they drain your willpower, and how they manipulate your executive function to your more hyper-reactive function. In part 2, we looked at the mechanisms of it through the algorithm itself and how they distort your perception of reality and the people around you, how they inflate the outrageous anecdote and then use that as a straw man in order to, in essence, get you to engage in a hyperpolarized accelerationist engine to, in essence, I mean, you can argue the conspiratorial element of it as to whether they are engineering the collapse, but you can't deny that the hyperpolarization and the increase in negativity, and more so the media's focus on mental health and technology, right? Like Jonathan Haidt's most recent, one of his books, The Anxious Generation, right, is a good example of that. And, it's kind of the logical endpoint of this technology, right? There's plenty of benefits to it, obviously, right? There is a utility to the technology and to social media in general. It's making our world more connected than ever before, right? But in these specific elements, our engagement is being deliberately manipulated. It's not being done, we are not being given these devices to use of our own free will. There is a ghost in the machine. There are things that are under the surface that are subtly manipulating our behaviors, and that the companies that build these technologies and run these social media companies know that it exists, and they use it. They exploit it, right? So that's in essence the treatise itself, and that's the end of this part of the video. Basically, we're going to then cover in the following video the manifesto. Now, I deliberately chose the word manifesto because it is a loaded term, and it is somewhat ironic if you compare the content in this treatise to a very famous manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future by Ted Kaczynski, right? Formerly known as the Unabomber. And the themes in his manifesto are not so totally divorced from the ideas in this treatise, right? Ted Kaczynski talks about how we will become over-socialized as human beings, and that it will lead to a fragmentation of society, right? That technology and our push towards integrating it, more and more of it, into our lives is going to, in essence, lead to a de-evolution of our society in general, and to a collapse, right? And if you see the through lines to this treatise, right, you can see through infrastructural psychosis, if social media and technology infrastructure is deliberately designed to induce a state of psychosis, then the reality is, no pun intended, that our reality is being broken, right? And this is going to affect various people on different levels, I can be preaching to the choir in a lot of respects. I don't want to sound like I'm condescending to people, or that I don't respect your intelligence, right? These are concepts that, me personally, I've looked into over 10 or more years. I'm not a trained neuroscientist. I'm not a philosopher, right? I'm a blue-collar, cis white hetero male, I guess you could say, to use the pronoun aspect of it. And I just have this idea, and I want to put it out there without any political ideology attached to it, because I feel like that hyperpolarization is in essence part of the problem, right? Similar to how, I didn't choose to put this content in a slickly put together and quickly edited film with background music and stock images flashing all over the place. Like, I don't want to feed into this idea that I need to manipulate your psyche to get you to understand these ideas, right? So that's the idea. That's the treatise. And in the next video, we're going to get into the manifesto. Now, the manifesto is, in essence, diagnosing the problem and proposing a solution, right? So if infrastructural psychosis is the problem, then the manifesto is how do we identify this problem? How do we address it? And as it shows in the subtitle of the treatise itself, what can you do about it, right? How can you have it not affect you? How can you, use it for more positivity in your life and, allow yourself to make better decisions, right? So I'll see you in the next video. Appreciate you stopping by. Take care.